The name on the grave marker read Harold Talmadge, and for 7 years, Margaret had worn that name like a second skin stitched over her own, permanent as a brand, until she had nearly forgotten there was ever a woman underneath it. The town of Cutter's Creek, Texas, sat in the rolling hill country just west of San Antonio, and in the year 1882, it was a place that knew its residents by their losses just as much as their fortunes. A woman alone in that world was a particular kind of visible, noticed by every pair of eyes that wanted something from her, invisible to anyone who might truly see her. Margaret had learned that in the first weeks after Harold died, and she had carried the knowledge quietly ever since, the way a person carries a stone in their boot. You get used to the weight. You forget it's there. But the ache never fully leaves. She had been 22 years old when she married Harold Talmadge. He was 15 years her senior, a cattleman with broad shoulders and a good reputation, a man who had presented himself to her father with a handshake and an offer that made financial sense. Her father had been a struggling dry goods merchant in a town that was drying up, and Harold had land and cattle and a future. Margaret had been consulted, but only just. She had said yes in the way a person says yes when no feels impossible, and she had meant to make the best of it. Harold had not been a cruel man. That was what she told people when they asked, and it was true. He had not raised his hand to her, had not spoken to her with contempt, had not gambled away their savings or drunk himself senseless on Friday nights. He had been steady and practical and completely uninterested in who she was beneath the surface of her usefulness. In 7 years of marriage, he had never once asked her what she dreamed about. He had never asked what she found beautiful, what she feared, what she had wanted to be before the wanting got swallowed up by necessity. He had called her Mrs. Talmadge almost exclusively, as though her Christian name were a courtesy he had never seen the need to extend. She had been 29 when he died. A horse had thrown him in the north pasture on a Tuesday afternoon in October, and by Thursday morning he was gone, a bruise at his temple the size of a silver dollar, and a silence that settled over the house like snow. Margaret had buried him in the small cemetery at the edge of their property, beside the 2 children they had lost in infancy, and she had stood at that grave with dry eyes and a guilt she could not name, the guilt of feeling more relief than grief, and then the deeper guilt of knowing that relief meant something about her life that she had not let herself look at directly. 7 years. She had run the ranch through 7 years of drought and cattle prices that swung like a pendulum, and the constant low hum of men who thought a widow's land was a negotiation rather than a fact. She had hired hands who respected her and fired hands who did not. She had learned to read contracts by lamplight until her eyes burned, had learned the difference between a fever in a steer that passed and one that didn't, had ridden fence lines in January cold with her jaw set against the wind. She had become, in those years, entirely competent, entirely capable, entirely herself in every way that mattered to the functioning of things, and entirely alone in every way that didn't. It was the end of March in 1882 when the new man came to Cutter's Creek. Margaret heard about him the way she heard about most things through Dolores Vasquez, who ran the laundry on the main street and whose ears collected information the way rain barrels collected water. Dolores told her on a Wednesday morning that a man named Luke Prescott had come through from up around Abilene, that he was looking for work, that he was handy with horses in a way that people talked about, and that he had rented a room above the feed store for what he claimed would be a week or 2. Margaret needed a horseman. She had lost her best ranch hand, a fellow named Curtis, to a homestead claim down south 3 weeks earlier, and her remaining 2 men were solid workers, but neither of them had the particular gift with horses that the work required. She had a young quarter horse mare named Biscuit who had gone wrong-tempered after a bad shoeing, and a bay gelding that had developed a reluctance to enter the barn that was becoming a genuine problem as spring storms rolled through. She needed someone who understood horses the way some people understood music, not just the mechanics of it, but the feeling underneath. She rode into town that Thursday morning on her roan gelding Pepper, tied him to the post in front of Harlow's general store, and went about her business with the deliberate efficiency that 7 years of self-sufficiency had carved into her habits. She bought flour and salt and a new length of rope. She reviewed a bill of sale with Harlow himself, a round-faced man who had long since stopped being surprised by her competence. She was carrying her second paper bag toward the door when she nearly walked into the man coming in from the outside. He caught the bag before she lost it. His hands were quick, reflexive, and large, the hands of a man who worked with animals, with calluses in the particular places that told you something. He stepped back immediately, creating space, which she noticed because it was not what most men did. "Beg your pardon, ma'am," he said. "That was entirely my fault." She looked at him. He was perhaps 34, 35, with a lean, weathered face and dark eyes that were direct without being aggressive. He wore a plain work shirt and canvas trousers and a hat that had seen considerable weather. There was nothing remarkable about him except for the quality of his attention, which was focused and genuine in a way that registered on her like a change in temperature. "No harm done," she said, taking the bag back from his hands. "You're Luke Prescott." It was not a question. His mouth curved slightly at one corner. "I am, and you have me at a disadvantage." "Margaret Talmadge," she said. "I run the Talmadge Ranch about 4 miles east." "I've heard you're good with horses." "I've heard you need someone who is," he said, without any performance of modesty or excessive pride, just the plain statement of two facts meeting each other. She studied him for a moment. In 7 years of hiring men, she had developed what she privately thought of as her instincts, a collection of small observations that added up to a judgment she trusted more than most formal recommendations. The way he had stepped back to give her space. The way he was looking at her face rather than cataloging her the way some men did, assessing worth in a way that made her feel like livestock at an auction. The steadiness of him. "Can you come by tomorrow morning?" She said, 7 o'clock, I'll show you what needs doing and we can discuss terms." "I'll be there," he said simply. She walked out into the March sunlight with her bags and did not look back, though she was aware with a clarity that surprised her that something had shifted. She could not have said what. It was not dramatic. It was more like the feeling of a door that had been stuck for a very long time suddenly swinging open on its hinges, just a crack, just enough to let in a line of light. He arrived at 6:58 the next morning, which she noted because she had been watching from the kitchen window with a cup of coffee she had not been tasting. He rode a good-looking blue roan that moved with an easy, unhurried cadence, and he sat the horse the way men who have spent their lives on horseback sit them, as though the distinction between horse and rider was merely technical. She met him at the fence gate, and they shook hands with a professional directness that suited them both. She showed him around the place, the main barn with its 12 stalls, the smaller holding pen to the west, the pasture where the cattle were beginning to graze with the new spring grass coming up thin but green. She explained the situation with the mare Biscuit, and he listened without interrupting, without offering advice before he understood the problem. When she had finished, he asked to see the mare. She brought Biscuit out to the yard on a lead rope. The horse was a small, compact animal, deep chestnut with a white star, and she was clearly unhappy, her ears pinned, her movements stiff and resentful. Luke stood at a distance first, just watching. Then he moved forward slowly, not toward the horse's head but toward her shoulder, angling his body sideways, making himself smaller, less threatening. Biscuit's ears flicked. Luke stopped. He waited. He spoke, low and even, words that were not really words but more the sound of reassurance. Margaret watched him work for the better part of 20 minutes, and by the end of it, Biscuit had taken 3 steps toward him of her own accord, which was more than she had done for anyone in 3 weeks. "Bad shoeing, like you said," Luke told her when he came back to the fence where she was leaning. "Someone was rough with her and she remembers it. She'll come around. It takes patience and consistency." "Those are qualities I value in a hand," she said. They discussed wages. He asked for fair terms and not a penny above fair, which she also noted. She offered him the use of the small bunkhouse at the back of the property, which had a wood stove and was perfectly adequate, and he accepted without making it into a negotiation. He started work that same day. The first weeks were professional and productive and characterized by a mutual efficiency that Margaret found deeply satisfying. He was good at his work, better than good, in the way that a person is when a skill runs through them bone deep. Within a week, Biscuit was accepting his hands on her feet without protest. Within 2 weeks, the barn-shy gelding was walking in calmly at his quiet direction. Her other 2 hands, a pair of brothers named Roy and Dennis Marsh, liked him immediately, which mattered because the Marsh brothers were not easy men to impress. They were Texans of the older school, practical and spare with their approval, and they treated Luke as an equal within days. Margaret worked alongside her men as she always had. She did not manage from a distance, had never been able to. She was out in the cold and the mud and the long sun-soaked days the same as anyone. And it was in that shared work that she and Luke began to talk in the way that people talk when they are doing something together, and the silence between them becomes easy enough that words come naturally. He told her he was from Kansas originally, that he had come south after a decade of trail driving up the Kishom Trail, that he had reached a point in his life where driving cattle 1,000 miles for someone else's profit felt less appealing than he had once been willing to accept. He said it without bitterness, just as a statement of a life that had run its course in one direction and was looking for another. She told him about the ranch, about the years after Harold's death, about the work of keeping it alive through lean seasons. She did not tell him about the loneliness. She did not tell him about the nights when the house felt too large, and the silence in it felt different from the silence of open land, smaller, more pressing, like something with weight. She was not ready for that. But one evening in early April, they were both leaning on the fence at the south pasture watching the last of the day go down behind the hills, the sky turning that particular shade of deep amber that the Texas spring produced like a gift, and he said something that caught her off guard. He said, "What was your name before, if you don't mind my asking?" She turned to look at him. The question was so simple and so entirely without agenda that for a moment she could not parse it. She had been Mrs. Talmadge or Margaret Talmadge for so long, and before that she had been Miss Hollies, her father's daughter, and before that, what? Who had she been before the name she was born with got handed off to a husband she barely knew? Hollies, she said. Margaret Hollies. He nodded slowly as though he were placing something carefully. That's a good name, he said. Hollies, it suits you. It was such a small thing. It ought not to have done anything to her at all. But something happened in her chest at that moment that she had no words for, a kind of releasing, a warmth that came from somewhere old and buried, as though a part of her that had been held very still for a very long time had been given permission to move. No one had asked that in 7 years. Not one person. Not her neighbors, not her hired men, not the women she took Sunday dinner with in town, not the banker who knew every detail of her finances. No one had thought to ask. He had asked. She looked back at the sunset so he would not see whatever was happening on her face. "And yours," she said. "Prescott is the family name. What does Luke come from?" "My grandfather on my mother's side," he said. "Lucas William Harker, who came out of Virginia after the war and never stopped moving west. I never knew him, but my mother loved him something fierce, so she gave me his name." "Luke suits you too," she said, and she meant it, though she was not sure she could have explained exactly why. After that evening, something between them shifted again. The way the landscape shifts after a rain, the same geography, but everything fresher, the colors more present, the air carrying a quality it did not have before. They had not said anything romantic. They had not done anything that her 2 hired hands could have remarked upon. But the knowing between them had deepened, like a river after snowmelt, fuller and a little more urgent. She began to look forward to mornings in a way she had not in a long time. There was a particular hour, just before breakfast, when the light was new and the animals were settling from the night, and the whole ranch smelled of damp grass and wood smoke. and often she would come out to find Luke already at work in the barn, and they would exchange good mornings that carried more inside them than the words themselves. She caught herself making the coffee with more care than was strictly necessary. She noticed when he was tired and made sure there was extra bread at midday. She was not naive about what this was. She was 36 years old and had been managing her own interior life through difficult years. She knew what it felt like when someone mattered to you. She just had not expected it to happen the way it was happening, gradually, quietly, like spring coming in, not all at once but one warm day at a time. He was careful with her. She noticed that too. He made no advances, offered no unnecessary touches, did not crowd her or maneuver conversations toward personal territory she had not opened. He seemed to understand, without her having to say it, that she was a woman who had had things decided for her, and that being given space to arrive at her own conclusions was not indifference on his part but respect. She had met very few men in her life who understood that distinction. Most men who were not aggressive simply called themselves patient, but their patience was a waiting rather than a genuine giving over of control. His was different. It was real. There was an evening in late April when a storm came through fast from the northwest, the kind that rolled in off the open land with very little warning, and the four of them scrambled to get the horses into the barn, and the cattle pushed toward the lower pasture where there was shelter. By the time it was done, the rain was coming sideways, and the sky was a particular angry purple that meant the storm had more to give. They all ran for the barn rather than trying to make it to the bunkhouse, and the five of them, Margaret, Luke, Roy, Dennis, and Biscuit, the mare who had finally stopped being angry, stood in the lantern-lit dimness listening to the rain hammer the roof, and Margaret felt something she had not felt in years. She felt the pleasure of being warm inside a storm. Roy and Dennis played cards on a hay bale. Luke sat near Biscuit's stall with a piece of tack that needed mending, his hands working the leather with practiced patience. Margaret sat on an overturned bucket near the lantern with the account book she had brought from the house, but she was not reading the numbers. She was watching his hands, the way they moved, the gentleness in them. He looked up and caught her watching, and she did not look away, which surprised her. She held his gaze for a moment and then returned to her account book, but her heart was going at a pace that had nothing to do with arithmetic. From the corner of her eye she saw the small, private smile that crossed his face, and she had to press her lips together to keep her own from answering it. After the storm passed and the brothers had gone to the bunkhouse, Margaret and Luke walked from the barn to the house together under a sky that had washed itself clean, the stars out now in thick, brilliant clusters. The mud sucked at their boots and the air smelled of rain and cedar and the particular freshness of a Texas night after weather. At the porch steps they stopped. She turned to face him and the starlight was generous, catching the angles of his face and the dark honesty of his eyes. "Thank you," she said, "for your help tonight." "It's what I'm here for," he said, but his voice had something in it beyond the practical. "Is it?" she said, and it came out softer than she had intended. And he understood what she meant. She could see that he understood, and there was a long pause that was not uncomfortable but was full in the way that spaces are before something important happens. "I hope it's not just that," he said quietly, with a plainness that was more intimate than anything elaborate could have been. She went inside and stood in her dark kitchen for a moment with her hand pressed flat against her sternum, not in distress but in acknowledgement. Something was real. Something she had not expected to be real again was real. May came in warm and golden, and the cattle were doing well, and the ranch had the humming, productive quality of a place that was being properly cared for. Margaret received an offer on a parcel of the eastern land from a man named Byers, who ran the neighboring spread, and had been trying to acquire pieces of her property for 4 years through various stratagems. She refused it, as she always did, and sent him a letter that was cordial and unmistakable in equal measure, because she had learned that unclear refusals just invited renegotiation. Luke was there when Byers himself rode over one morning to discuss it in person, and Byers looked at Luke in the way that men like Byers always looked at other men near a widow, evaluating the geometry of the situation, trying to determine the nature of the arrangement. Margaret introduced Luke as her foreman, which surprised them both slightly because she had not used that title before, but it settled in her mouth as naturally accurate as soon as she said it. After Byers left, looking somewhat deflated, Luke said, "Foreman." "If that suits you," she said, not looking at him, adjusting a piece of harness on its peg. "It suits me fine," he said. There was warmth in it that she let herself feel. One Sunday in mid-May, she went to church as she always did, and at the social afterward, where the women gathered with pie and the men stood in the sun with their hats in their hands, her neighbor Eliza Caldwell asked about the new hand she had taken on. "Prescott." Margaret said. "He came to Sunday service last week," Eliza said, as though this were information of particular significance. Eliza was a kind woman who had been trying to find Margaret a second husband for approximately 5 of the 7 years of her widowhood, with a cheerful persistence that Margaret found more endearing than annoying. "I believe he has," Margaret said. "He asked after you," Eliza said. "When I mentioned your name, he had a look about him." Margaret picked up her glass of lemonade. "Eliza, I'm just saying what I saw," Eliza said unabashedly. Margaret did not say anything else, but she drove home through the afternoon warmth with the windows of her buckboard open and the smell of Texas spring all around her, and a feeling in her chest that was entirely too much like hope to ignore. She had not let herself hope in a long time. After Harold died, she had put hope in a box and labeled it unnecessary and tucked it somewhere deep, because hope without an object felt like a waste of the kind of energy she needed for practical things. But now the box had been found and opened, and the hope was out, and it was entirely inconvenient and also, quietly, magnificently alive. She asked him that evening while they were doing the last check on the stock before supper. She did not approach it sidelong or set it up with preliminary remarks. She was not a woman who had learned to go at things indirectly. She said, "Eliza Caldwell told me you asked after me at church." He was checking the latch on the east stall. He kept his hands on the latch but turned his head to look at her. "I did," he said. "Why?" she said. He turned fully then, facing her in the dim barn, the evening light coming in low and amber through the open door behind him. "Because I find that I think about you considerably," he said, with the same plainness he brought to everything. "And I wanted to know what people who have known you longer than I have seen you. And what did Eliza tell you?" "She said you were the most capable woman she had ever met and the loneliest, and that she hoped something would change for you." He paused. "I didn't prompt that last part." Margaret was quiet for a moment. The words landed in her precisely, capable and lonely. Yes. Both of those things were true. And the fact that someone, that he, was looking at her squarely enough to hold both of them at once, without trying to manage or diminish either one, felt like something enormously rare. "I have been lonely," she said, because it was true and he deserved the truth, and she was tired, suddenly and profoundly, of carrying things alone that did not have to be carried alone. "I know," he said gently. "I was married for 7 years to a man who was not unkind," she said, "but who never once asked me my name, not my real name, not who I was." She heard her own voice and was surprised by its steadiness. "You asked me within 2 weeks of meeting me." Something moved across his face, understanding, perhaps, or the recognition of something he had suspected but not confirmed. He said, "I wanted to know who you were." "Why?" she asked again, and this time the word had more in it. He stepped toward her, not too close, just close enough. "Because you are worth knowing," he said. "Every part of you, not just what you can manage or maintain, but all of it. The woman inside all of it." She felt the tears before she understood they were coming, not from grief but from a kind of release that had no other expression, the way a dam does not break all at once but finds the first small gap and lets the water through in a rush. She turned her face to the side briefly, gathering herself, and he did not reach for her, did not rush the moment, simply waited with the patience that was entirely his own. When she turned back, her eyes were bright but her chin was steady. "Luke Prescott," she said. "Margaret Hollies," he said, and the way he said it, her name, her real name, the one she had been before she was anything else to anyone, was the most intimate thing she had ever heard. They stood in the warm quiet of the barn with the horses breathing around them, and the evening coming down outside and the whole world feeling very soft and open. And she reached out and took his hand, just that, just his hand in hers, and he closed his fingers around her slowly, and they stood like that for a long time without speaking. Summer came in like a brass band, loud, brash, scorchingly hot, and full of color. The cattle were fat and the grass was holding, and the small creek that ran through the south quarter of the Talmadge property was running faster than it had in 3 years. Margaret had lived through enough hard summers to be grateful for a good one without taking it for granted, and she moved through those weeks with a sense of abundance that had as much to do with what was happening in her heart as in her pastures. She and Luke had spoken since that evening in the barn, spoken properly, deliberately, in the way that two people speak when they have acknowledged something true between them and are learning the territory of it together. They ate supper on the porch some evenings, just the two of them, after the Marsh brothers had gone to the bunkhouse, and they talked the way she had almost forgotten people could talk about everything, about nothing, about the past and the country and the small, urgent things that made up daily life and the larger, slow things underneath it. He told her about the trail drives in detail, the particular hardships and the particular beauties of moving 1,000 cattle across 3 states, the thunderstorms on the open prairie that made the sky feel like a ceiling pressing down, the river crossings that went wrong and the ones that went right, the nights when the cook made something extraordinary out of very little, and the whole crew sat around the fire feeling briefly and completely content. He told her about a friend he had lost on the trail 10 years back, a man named Peter Hayes who had drowned crossing the Red River, and how that loss had sat with him long afterward, the way certain losses did, not loudly but persistently. She told him about her childhood, about her father's store and the smell of dry goods, cotton and coffee, and the particular dusty sweetness of dried beans, and about the girl she had been before she became what she needed to be. She had been a reader, she told him, astonishing in how much she revealed with that simple fact. She had read everything she could get her hands on, novels and newspapers and the almanac and the Bible and anything that came through the store in someone's saddlebag. She had loved stories because stories were the one place where a person's interior life was considered worth the telling. He listened to all of it with a quality of attention that she had never experienced from another human being. Not politely, not with the half-present nod of someone waiting for their turn to speak, but genuinely, fully, as though each thing she said was exactly what he had been hoping to hear. One evening in late June, she brought out a book she had not opened in years, a collection of poems by a man whose name she could barely remember, bought at a church sale a decade ago, and kept because she could not bring herself to part with it. She read him a poem by lamplight, sitting side by side on the porch bench, his shoulder warm against hers, and when she finished he was quiet for a moment and then said, "Read another." She did, and then another. It was a night that seemed to exist outside of ordinary time, the fireflies beginning their summer business in the long grass, the horses quiet in the barn, the stars appearing one by one as the dark deepened, and the two of them closed together in the yellow lamplight, the words of someone else's making carrying something of their own feeling between them. He kissed her that night. She had not quite expected it at that specific moment, though she had been expecting it in the larger sense for weeks. He turned to look at her in the middle of the third poem, and she looked back, and the book was simply no longer relevant to what was happening between them, and he leaned toward her and she leaned toward him, and the kiss was quiet and warm and tasted of the coffee they had shared and the summer air. When they drew back, she looked at him and he looked at her, and she was so surprised by her own happiness that she laughed a real laugh, sudden and unguarded and entirely hers, and it seemed to delight him completely, and he laughed too, and they sat together on that porch laughing at their own happiness like two people who had been in a drought so long they had forgotten how good rain felt. She said, "I have not felt like this in a very long time." "Neither have I," he said. "Not ever, if I'm being truthful." "Not ever," she repeated. "There were women I liked well enough," he said carefully, "and I don't mean to make more of it than it was. But I never sat with someone and felt like I was exactly where I was supposed to be. I always felt like I was heading somewhere, still in motion. The trail never ended." He paused. "You feel like the end of the trail, and I mean that the best way I know how." She took his hand on the bench between them. "I know what you mean," she said. "I feel it too." July was hot and full of small wonders. There was a day when a clutch of bluebird eggs hatched in a nest on the east fence post, and Margaret showed Luke, and they stood watching the blind, furious little birds with their silent, screaming mouths. And she thought she had never seen anything so perfectly vulnerable or so perfectly determined. There was an afternoon when Roy Marsh fell off a hay wagon and broke his wrist, and she said it herself with a steadiness that made Luke look at her, with an expression she was beginning to know well, admiration, genuine and uncomplicated, for the person she was rather than the person she was supposed to be. There was a Sunday when they rode together to the hills north of the property, just the two of them, ostensibly to check the north fence line, but actually to spend a morning in the particular way that people in the early phase of love spend mornings, slow and attentive, and very aware of the other person's presence in the light. They tied the horses at a cedar tree and sat on a flat limestone shelf looking out over the valley below, where the creek caught the sun in bright broken pieces, and the land stretched green gold to the horizon. She told him about the children she had lost. She had not talked about this with anyone except Eliza briefly, in the abstract language of loss that women used with each other when the direct language felt too heavy. She told him their names: the first, a boy she had called James after Harold's father, gone at 2 weeks old. The second, a girl they had named Eliza Rose, who had lived only 9 days. She told him how she had stood at those small graves and felt the most complete grief she had ever known, and how Harold had squeezed her hand once at each burial and then gone back to the work of the ranch, and how she had gone back to the work of the ranch too, because the work was what there was. Luke did not offer the usual consolations, which she was grateful for. He said, "I'm sorry. I'm sorry that happened to you, and I'm sorry you had to carry it the way you did." She looked out at the valley. "I carried a lot of things the way I did," she said. "You won't have to anymore," he said, not as a promise made carelessly, but as a statement of intent, clear and considered. "I'm not asking you to put anything down that you want to keep, but the things you've been carrying alone, you don't have to anymore." She turned to look at him in the full noon light, the sun honest and direct on both their faces. "Are you telling me something specific?" she said. "I am," he said. "I am asking you a specific thing. I would ask you formally and properly if you'll give me the chance." "You are asking me to marry you," she said. "I am hoping you'll let me ask," he said. "More importantly, I'm hoping you'll say yes." She was quiet for a long moment. The valley stretched below them. The horses moved behind them, tack clinking softly, the familiar sound of animals at rest. She thought about who she had been when she married the first time, young and without options, and walking into a life that had been arranged around her rather than with her. She thought about who she was now, 36 years old, a woman who had built something real with her own hands and judgment, who had decided what she needed and gone after it and defended it when it was threatened. A woman who had carried one name for 7 years and who, in the company of this man, had begun to remember the name underneath it. She was not afraid. That surprised her now that she examined herself. She had expected, if this moment ever came, to feel some echo of the old pressure, the old sense of a door closing. She felt none of it. What she felt instead was the opening, the continuance. "Yes," she said. He exhaled, and she saw something leave him, a tension he had been holding carefully, and the smile that replaced it was enormous and unguarded and entirely boyish, and she thought she had never seen anything more lovely. He had a ring. She had not expected that. He produced it from his shirt pocket, a simple gold band with a small turquoise stone set into it. The stone the particular blue-green of shallow water over limestone. And he told her he had bought it from a silversmith in San Antonio when he rode in for supplies 2 weeks ago, because he had known for 2 weeks and possibly longer that this was what he intended. She held her hand out and he slid it onto her finger, and they both looked at it sitting there, and she felt its weight, which was different from the weight of things she had been carrying, lighter and warm with the sun on it, and entirely chosen. They rode back to the ranch in the afternoon, side by side, and Roy and Dennis, who had apparently discussed the matter between themselves and arrived at a predictive consensus, were somehow unsurprised. Roy shook Luke's hand with his good wrist, and Dennis hugged Margaret with an awkward sincerity that made her laugh. And Dolores Vasquez, who had somehow arrived at the ranch that very afternoon on the pretext of returning a borrowed pot, was so delighted that she clasped her hands together and said a great deal in rapid Spanish, and then hugged them both. The town of Cutter's Creek received the news with the particular combination of goodwill and commentary that small towns produce at such occasions. Eliza Caldwell wept with happiness and demanded to know everything about the proposal, and said she had known from the moment she saw the look on Luke's face at church. The Reverend Davies spoke to them on the following Sunday with a warmth that was genuine, having observed Margaret's steadfast management of her circumstances over 7 years with respect and quiet admiration. Byers, when he heard, sent a card of congratulation that was technically correct in its sentiments and deeply insincere in its implication, which Margaret and Luke found privately amusing. There were practical matters. There was the question of Luke's formal status on the ranch, which they discussed with the straightforward honesty that had always characterized their dealings, and they agreed together that the ranch was and would remain Margaret's, that she had built it and kept it, and it carried her name, and that he was coming into something she had made rather than making something new with her, and that this was a fact of their life together that he not only accepted but honored. He said he would not have wanted it any other way. She believed him. They were married in September when the heat had broken and the Texas Hill Country was moving into the amber and russet of its particular autumn beauty. The ceremony was at the church in Cutter's Creek on a Saturday morning, with the whole town in attendance, and the wildflowers that grew along the creek banks cut and arranged by Dolores and Eliza together in white and gold along every pew. Margaret wore a dress she had made herself from good ivory wool, because she was not a woman who did not make her own things, and she wore her hair the way she never wore it in working life, loose and dark and full, falling past her shoulders. Luke wore his best clothes, which were clean and pressed and simple, and when he saw her come down the aisle with Roy Marsh awkwardly serving as a stand-in for her long-deceased father, his face did something that she knew she would remember for the rest of her life. It was not merely happiness, though it was that. It was the look of a man who had been looking for something a long time and had found it, and whose finding of it felt both like an arrival and a beginning. The Reverend Davies asked the familiar questions. When he came to the matter of names, the formal recitation of who they were to each other and to the town, Luke turned to her fully and said her name, her whole name. Margaret Hollies, he said, and then Talmadge, and then Prescott, giving her the full run of herself. I ask you to be my wife. She could feel Eliza crying somewhere behind her. She could feel the warm September sun through the church windows and the smell of the cut flowers and the particular hush of a room full of people witnessing something true. She took his hands in both of hers. Yes, she said. I say yes. The reception was at the Caldwell farm. Long tables set up under the oak trees that grew in Eliza's front yard, and there was food enough for twice the number gathered, because Eliza had cooked for 3 days, and everyone else had brought something, and nobody in a small Texas town in 1882 came to a celebration underprepared. There was music, a fiddler named Tomás, who was Dolores' nephew, and a young man with a guitar, and they played dance music until the sun went down and then some time past it. Margaret danced with Luke under the oak trees with the lantern light warm and shifting around them, and she pressed her cheek against his shoulder and felt his hand broad and steady in the small of her back, and the fiddle played something that went into her like light into water, dispersing and warm, and she thought, "Here I am. Here finally and properly is where I am." Autumn moved through the ranch with its usual demands: the fall roundup, the culling of the herd, the preparations for winter that always felt both tedious and urgent. Luke threw himself into the work as though he had been there from the beginning, which in the ways that mattered he had. He had a gift for anticipating what needed doing before the problem became urgent, which was the mark of a genuinely experienced ranch hand, and the Marsh brothers had come to treat him with a respect that had moved beyond courtesy into something more like genuine partnership. Margaret found herself learning things she had not known in 7 years of soul management, not because she had been doing anything wrong, but because two people looking at the same problem from slightly different angles sees more of it together. Luke had ideas about the horse breeding operation that were sound and forward-thinking, the kind of ideas that required a longer investment horizon than she had been willing to consider when the ranch's survival was not certain. They talked it through over evenings and correspondence with a broker in San Antonio, and by November they had purchased 2 additional mares from a breeder in New Braunfels with excellent bloodlines, and begun a small horse breeding side operation that would, if their planning held, produce results in 3 years. It was the kind of future-making that she had not let herself do for years. Planning 3 years out required the belief that you would be there in 3 years, that the ground beneath you was solid, that the structures of your life were not merely provisional. She had not believed those things, not really, not since Harold died, though she had performed the belief competently enough. She believed them now. She was surprised by how different it felt. Winter came hard that year, the kind of Texas winter that reminds you the hill country is not as mild as it sometimes pretends. There were cold fronts in December that dropped the temperature below freezing for a week at a stretch, and the horses needed extra care, and the cattle needed to be watched for signs of cold stress, and the woodpiles that Margaret had always kept adequate she now found herself keeping generous, because there were 2 of them in that house now, and warmth was no longer merely practical but had taken on additional dimensions of meaning. She loved the evenings. She had not expected to love evenings particularly, as evenings had been for years the hardest part of the day, the time when the house was quiet and the aloneness was most present. Now the evenings were full. Luke would sit by the wood stove with a piece of tack or a piece of reading, and she would sit with her accounts or her books, and they would talk or not talk, and the silence between them when it came was the silence of comfortable company rather than the silence of absence. She could hear him breathing. She could hear the small sounds of his presence in the house. She had not understood until she had it how much she had missed the simple sound of another person. It was in late January of 1883 that she told him she was expecting. She had suspected for 3 weeks and had wanted to be certain before she spoke, because she had been through the hope and the loss twice before, and she knew better than to give words to something that might not hold. But when she was certain as a woman can be at 7 weeks, she told him on a Sunday morning, sitting across the kitchen table from him with 2 cups of coffee between them and the winter light coming in pale and clear through the east window. She said, "I believe I'm with child." He went very still in the way that people go still when something enormous has arrived. And then he stood up from the table and came around to her side of it and dropped to his knees beside her chair and took her hands in both of his, and she saw on his face a vulnerability and a joy that she had never seen on any man's face that she could remember. He looked at her with an expression that was so open and unguarded that she felt her own eyes fill. "Are you well?" He said, which was the first thing he said, and it was the right first thing, not excitement first, not celebration first, but her well-being first. "I am," she said. "I feel good, better than the last times, even early." "We'll be careful," he said. "We'll do everything that needs doing. I'll ride for Dr. Emmett if you need anything at all." She smiled at him. "I don't need a doctor today," she said. "Today I just needed to tell you." He pressed her hands to his lips, and she felt the warmth of it against her knuckles, and the whole still winter morning seemed to hold its breath with them. Spring came back as it always did, indifferent to the seasons of human lives, but coincidentally generous this time, arriving in late February with early wildflowers on the south-facing slopes and a quality of light that felt like encouragement. Margaret continued her work through the first months with the modification of doing nothing that involved significant physical risk, which Luke enforced with a gentle firmness that she occasionally chafed at and mostly appreciated. He had begun to build a room. She had not asked him to, but one morning in March she had come out of the house to find him measuring the east wall with a length of string and a focused expression. He had drawn up a plan in his careful, practical hand, a small room off the east side of the house, with a window that faced the morning sun and enough space for a crib and a rocking chair and the beginning of a life. She had stood beside him looking at his sketches on the paper for a long time, neither of them speaking, and the plan had been simple and earnest and entirely exactly right. Roy and Dennis helped him frame it in April, and by the end of May the room existed, properly plastered and floored, with a window that she had curtained in yellow calico from Harlow's store because yellow had seemed right, the color of beginnings. The baby came in August, a boy, strong and loud from the first breath, with a head full of dark hair and eyes that would settle eventually into the dark brown that both his parents shared. They named him James Lucas Prescott, the first name for the son she had lost, and in doing so making a kind of peace with that loss. The second name for Luke's grandfather, whom he had never known, completing a small circle of lineage that stretched from Virginia to Texas, by way of a Kansas boyhood and a ranch in the hill country. Margaret went through the labor with the same determination she brought to everything, with Dolores Vasquez serving as midwife and Luke pacing the front porch, with a concentration of worry that Dolores periodically came out to address with pointed remarks about the unhelpfulness of nervous fathers. When the crying began, the baby's first full announcement of itself into the world, Margaret heard Luke say something from the porch that she could not make out, but that the raw quality of his voice told her was an expression of a relief, so profound it was nearly prayer. He came in when Dolores gave the all-clear, and he stood at the bedside looking at his wife and his son, with an expression that she would later try to describe and find she could not, except to say that it was the look of a man who understood exactly what he was looking at, and exactly what it meant. She put the baby into his arms and watched him hold the child, his hands, those careful, large hands that had gentled frightened horses and mended broken harness and traced the line of her jaw on Sunday mornings, holding the baby with the same instinctive, patient attention he brought to everything fragile. "James Lucas," he said, very quietly. "Hello," the baby answered, in the only language he currently had, which was noise, insistent and alive. The autumn of 1883 was the richest season Margaret could remember in many years, and she had a feeling that this was partly the objective truth of a good cattle year and a successful foaling season, and partly the prism of her own life, which had changed so thoroughly that the world seen through it could not help but appear more vivid. James was a healthy, thriving infant who approached his world with an appetite that made both his parents laugh frequently. He was interested in everything, the colors, the sounds, the faces above him, the horses particularly, which he watched with a focus that Luke found extremely gratifying. Dolores came by twice a week and treated the boy as though he were her personal achievement, which in some practical sense he partly was. Eliza Caldwell came by with pie and the particular warmth of a woman for whom other people's happiness is a genuine pleasure. Luke had fully established himself in the community of Cutter's Creek by this point, not through any particular effort at ingratiation, but through the organic process of being present and reliable and honest over a period of time. He was known as a good horseman and a fair dealer, and a man who showed up when showing up was required. He had helped 3 different neighbors in the area with emergency situations over the course of the year: a barn fire that needed many hands, a sick horse that needed night sitting through a crisis, a fence repair that had become urgent before a storm. He had not been asked. He had simply appeared with his hands ready. She found herself watching him sometimes with the particular attention that she had always given to things she wanted to understand completely. Not the appraising look of early assessment, but the loving look of ongoing discovery, the recognition that a person you know well is still capable of showing you new facets, that knowing someone deeply does not exhaust them, but rather deepens the pleasure of their continuing revelation. She was herself in this life, more fully than she had ever been. She had not expected that marriage would enlarge her rather than constrain her, because the first time it had done the latter so completely that she had stopped expecting otherwise. But this was different in every meaningful way. She was Margaret Prescott now, and she had chosen that name and chosen it fully, and it felt like wearing clothes that fit after years of wearing clothes that were close enough. She still thought about Harold sometimes, not with grief exactly, but with a kind of retrospective tenderness for the life she had lived under his name. The hard years of widow work, the slow building of herself, the long preparation for something she had not known was coming. She was grateful, strangely, for the difficulty of it, because it had made her who she was, the woman capable of recognizing what was real when it arrived, the woman who knew the difference between being chosen and being settled for. The horse breeding operation produced its first crop of foals in the spring of 1884, and 3 of the 4 were sound and promising, and the 4th was the most beautiful creature Margaret had seen in a long time, a Grella filly with extraordinary conformation, and a temperament that was so calm and intelligent that Luke started using her as a demonstration animal immediately. They named her Biscuit's cousin, because Biscuit, the once difficult mare, was the filly's dam, and the joke was not very sophisticated, but it always made them both smile. They sold 2 of the foals at good prices and kept 2 for the operation, and the following year's crop was planned with a care that felt like craftsmanship. Margaret had always understood cattle. She was learning to understand horses in a new way, through Luke's teaching, and the learning was one of the ongoing pleasures of their life together. He had knowledge she did not have. She had knowledge he did not have, and between them the ranch moved in directions neither could have taken alone. She got pregnant again in the late summer of 1884, which she announced with less anxiety than the first time, because James had been so thoroughly healthy and the circumstances of her life were so much more stable than they had been, and also because she had gotten rather good at reading the signs her own body gave her. Luke received this news sitting on the porch in the early evening, and his response was to set down his coffee and put his arm around her and say, with simple pleasure, "Another one." "Apparently so," she said. "Good," he said. She leaned into his shoulder. "Good," she agreed. The second child, born in the spring of 1885, was a girl. She came into the world somewhat more efficiently than James had, as though she had studied the logistics and decided there was no need for extended deliberation. She was smaller than James had been, with a quieter initial manner that within 3 weeks proved to be entirely deceptive, as she had opinions about her schedule and her surrounding atmosphere that she expressed with great clarity. They named her Anna Me Prescott. The Me was for Margaret's mother, who had died when Margaret was 12, and who she had thought of more in the last 2 years than she had in the decade before, perhaps because she was now doing the work of a mother herself, and feeling the particular closeness to the dead that comes when you step into something they inhabited. James, who was not yet 2, found his sister alternately bewildering and fascinating. He approached her crib with the expression of a scientist examining new data, and occasionally he extended a very small, very careful hand toward her face, and she stared at him with the focused blankness of the very young, and the whole interaction was so clearly the beginning of something long and complicated and essential that watching it regularly made both parents briefly speechless. The ranch was thriving by 1886. The horse operation had grown to a small but established reputation in the county. People came to them specifically for the quarter horses, which were known for temperament as well as conformation. The cattle numbers were healthy. They had taken on a third hand, a young man of 20 named Caleb Torres, who was the son of a family in the south part of the county, and who had an aptitude for the work that reminded Margaret of a younger Luke. She and Luke had discussed the hiring with the same thoroughness they brought to all decisions, and Caleb had been with them 8 months and was proving to be everything his aptitude had suggested. There was a morning in late 1886 that stood out in Margaret's memory afterward as a kind of crystallization of everything her life had become. She was standing at the kitchen window with her first cup of coffee, the early light coming in at an angle that made the kitchen glow amber, and she could see Luke in the yard below with James, who was 3, and had recently developed the passionate conviction that he was personally responsible for feeding the horses. Luke was letting him carry the small bucket of grain, supporting it with one hand so it did not spill, while James walked with the intense concentration of a child performing something very important. Biscuit's cousin, who was 4 now and tall and beautiful, bent her elegant head to the fence rail, and James held the bucket up to her with an expression of rapturous pride. Margaret stood at that window and she thought, "This is the shape of my life. This, right here. The yard and the horses and the man and the child and the morning light and the coffee going cold in her hand, because she was too absorbed in the watching of it." She thought about the grave marker with Harold's name on it that still stood at the edge of the eastern property, as it should, as it would continue to, because Harold had been real and his life had mattered even if their marriage had been the arrangement it was rather than the choice it should have been. She thought about the woman who had stood at that grave with dry eyes and a guilt she could not name, 7 years of management and loneliness ahead of her, carrying a name that had never been quite fully hers. She thought about a Thursday morning in March 1882, when she had nearly walked into a man outside Harlow's general store, and he had caught her bag and stepped back to give her space and introduced himself as Luke Prescott, and she had introduced herself as Margaret Talmadge because that was who she was, and he had nodded and been direct and competent and they had done business. And then a sunset 2 weeks later when he had said, "What was your name before?" And she had said, "Hollies." "Margaret Hollies." And he had said, "That's a good name. It suits you." 7 years of carrying another person's name, and this man had asked about hers within 2 weeks, not to challenge it or diminish it, but because he wanted to know who she was, all of who she was, the woman she had been before and the woman she had become and all the versions in between. She heard Luke laugh from the yard, the particular laugh he had when James did something that surprised or delighted him, and she heard James's responding shriek of pleasure, and Biscuit's cousin made a sound of equine comment on the proceedings, and the morning was entirely, completely, fully alive. She set down her cold coffee. She opened the kitchen door and walked out into the yard, into the October light that was warm and golden and everything the hill country offered in that season. And James saw her, and abandoned the grain bucket immediately in favor of running to her with his arms out, and she caught him and swung him up onto her hip, and he immediately pointed back at the horse with the authority of a man who has discovered something of significance. "Mama, she ate it," he said. "I see that," Margaret said, looking at Luke over the top of James's dark head. Luke was looking at her the way he often looked at her in morning light, fully, warmly, with the kind of attention that never felt like pressure, but always felt like the most wonderful thing a gaze could be. "Good morning," he said. "Good morning," she said. He walked over to her and kissed her, which James observed with the tolerant expression of a child who has accepted this particular parental behavior as a permanent feature of his environment. Then Luke put his arm around her shoulders and James tried to acquire his father's hand, and they stood together in the yard for a moment, all of them, even the horse, who was watching them over the fence with the superior calm of an animal who has seen quite a lot of human behavior and found most of it mildly entertaining. Anami was calling from inside the house, announcing the morning in the way she announced most things. Margaret could hear Dolors, who had recently taken on the role of helping with the children several days a week, responding with the cheerful volubility of a woman very much in her element. The smell of something cooking came out of the house with the morning air. "I should go in," Margaret said. "In a minute," Luke said, and he said it with a certainty that asked for nothing except the minute, and she stayed in it, leaning into his warmth, James between them and the horses at the fence and the sun coming up over the hills in that particular way it did in October, when it was finally past the summer's harshness and had remembered how to be gentle. She thought about the name she wore now. Margaret Prescott, with all three parts of it present and accounted for the name she had been born to, the name she had carried through the hardest years, and the name she had chosen with open eyes and a full heart on a September morning in a church decorated with wildflowers. It was her name. All of it was her name, and the man beside her had been the first to ask about the one that had been hers from the beginning. She had not known, 7 years ago, standing at Harold's grave in the October cold, that the ground under the grief and the guilt and the loneliness was not the end of something. She had not known it was preparation. She had not known that the work of those years, the managing and the fighting and the slow, patient building of herself into something strong enough to stand, was the making of a woman who would know what she was looking at when the real thing arrived. But it had been. And she had. And here was the life she had built and chosen, with a man who had asked her name, and kept asking who she was, and listened to the answers with the full, generous attention of a person who understood that knowing someone is not a destination, but a continuous and very worthwhile journey. The hills in October were the color of honey and rust, and the particular green that did not have a name, but that Texans recognized in their bones. The horses moved in the pasture below the house with the easy grace of well-cared-for animals. The children's voices wove through the morning air, James's chirping questions and Anami's commanding proclamations, forming a music that was entirely domestic and entirely extraordinary. Luke pressed his lips against her hair. She leaned her head back against his shoulder. James looked up at both of them and then returned his attention to the horses, because horses were considerably more interesting and he had priorities. The creek ran south of the house through its limestone bed, clear and cold, and from somewhere in the oak trees along its bank, a mockingbird was doing what mockingbirds did best, cycling through every song it had ever heard, stitching them together into something new, making a life's worth of music out of everything it had been given. Margaret listened to it. She thought she had never heard anything so fitting. A bird that carries every song it has ever learned and sings them all, and is none the lesser for the carrying. She was Margaret Prescott, and she knew her own name, and she knew who stood beside her, and the morning was good, and the land was good, and the years ahead were as open and full of possibility as the Texas sky above the hill country in autumn, wide and bright and immeasurably, incandescently real. She put her arms around her husband and her son, and she held the morning for exactly as long as it was hers to hold, which was all of it, every warm and living second of it, all the way through.